start again.
Okay, so the next focus area is a little bit more still on signals that we need to evaluate and focus areas. And one thing is to focus on feed mixer variation. Um, and we know that there's different um, rations on the farm that you will get to as well. It's the one that I formulate, which is on paper. It's the ration that's in the bunk, so that's after mixing. If it's properly mixed, you've seen the problem with moisture levels or the challenge. It's the ration that's consumed by the animal. So are they sorting, or are every mouthful the formulation that I did on paper? And then there's the ration that's absorbed. If we have a lot of antagonists or things like that, or mycotoxins, or anything that will affect the digestibility of our ration, and we will get to a few examples a little bit later. So the one that the animal consumes, in my view, the most important one, and the one that we focus as a team, between yourself as a vet and myself and the farm management, is to get that correct. And every mouthful must be the same, is to really focus on that. So when you get onto dairy farms, you will see they always say that the mix is properly mixed. It's always correct, which is a 95% of the cases when we have a challenge, not correct. I always enjoy when some of the vets are on the farm and they also walk around and they give feedback and say, please focus for me on this specific thing that I've just seen, to make sure and to ensure that we get the mixes properly done. I had a phone call a few weeks ago where we had a challenge with bruised grains, which was rotten, and the vet just phoned me and said, please focus for me on this. And the next few weeks we implemented protocols to make sure that that specific bruised grains is always fresh. So it's nice to work as a team and see signals on farm level and see things out of the same focus and the same eyes to help each other. So we use a lot of things to prevent selection. So water and molasses on the high veld is a standard, so that we have it a nice and wet TMR instead of a dry TMR, which animals can sort. So we do that, or we use that. If you go to a farm and you see these graphs in their parlor, and you see variants like that. So let's take the right picture on the right upper level, and you look at protein. So say for instance, the protein varies or varies from 16.5% protein in the TMR in that bunk up to as high as 19. That variance is way too high, an indication that the mix is not done properly if it's the same mix. So we just measure a lot of things to ensure that we get that correct. Most high producing farms do their own particle distribution. So they use that Penn State separator and they do it on a daily basis. So if you look at the bottom picture and you look at that, and I just need to move the photos out of my way, otherwise I can't see it. So if you go to a mix on this side, where the upper level was about 4 to 5%, but in the pan, the fine particles was below 50%. And you go to that mix 9, and suddenly a lot of material is in the bottom pan, which is an indication there's too much fines. And you can see there's also a drop in the longer fiber. So a mix like that will probably give you more problems instead of a mix where it's more optimal. So a lot of short fibers, and you will see a lot of long fiber in the manure, and passage rate of that manure will be quicker, and you will see problems in that specific farm. So we try to have it as even as possible with the equipment that we use on farms to really get cows. Let me just get my system to work, to get the cows to eat every day the same material. If you see things like that, then yeah, I did take a picture of this mixer wagon on a farm. It was still in use. It was a pasture-based farm. And you can see, look at the hole on the side of that mixer. So can that mixer mix properly? I can assure you not. The maintenance on this machine was so behind that there was no cutting knives still in there to really cut the fiber you can see there. So there was no maintenance, or the maintenance plan was well behind schedule to really get going with this. So you need to check these things with me on a farm to optimize the health of those cows. So getting into the last part, or almost the last part before we talk minerals, is leaky gut syndrome. You will see a lot of publications on this. You will also see a lot of conferences and symposia focusing on leaky gut syndrome, because this is a reality on dairy farms. And the research over the last few years from two groups around North America has really give us excellent information of why cows are sometimes battling on farms. So let's just define what if we talk leaky gut syndrome, this is when the digestive system does not have the capacity or the potential to block any unwanted molecules, things like mycotoxins, etc., to penetrate the digestive tract barrier and therefore entering the bloodstream or the body of the animal. So we, when we go through the slides, it's actually a very not nice, or not nice, nice information that clear up some of the questions in our heads of why do we see in South Africa some things happening in a cow. We can't explain that just only by the lower dry matter intakes. So we will get to a few examples on that. You know better than me, the digestive tract has two main reasons. The one is to digest and absorb, and the other one is to keep the pathogens and the parasites and the enzymes and the E. coli and salmonella, all those negative things or unwanted molecules out of the body. And when we look at how some of these farms operate and how they manage these cows, it's scary to think of how much mucus we see in manure on some of the farms just due to someone not doing his job. Okay, so how big is that? How big is that area of absorption? People are currently trying to calculate that in dairy cows. How big is that intestinal wall absorption area? We know if we talk humans, we know that the size of that intestinal wall absorption is as big as a double tennis court. Now, Prof. Lance Baumgart indicated that he thinks that a cow is about 8 times the size of a human's intestinal wall absorption area. So, but that's speculation. They're trying to calculate that now to see, can they get to a specific figure? But if our absorption area is this big, then we know that our immune function, or why our immune function is so focused, 70% of that on this absorption area of the intestinal or the intestinal wall absorption area, because it's so big. We know that looking at the reticular rumen and the omasum, there's different layers. I don't need to show that actually to you, but just remember that in comparison to the lower intestine. And then also that mucus line, which we will talk about a little bit later as well. but there's different layers. But if animals are challenged, as what I will show you now with heat stress or ketosis, that inner layer or that layer changes a little bit, and that creates some issues or problems on farm levels. So if we talk about, for example, heat stress from Prof. Baumgart, if we look at the heat stress and we calculate or back calculate the lower dry matter intakes that we normally see with heat stress, only 50% of the decrease in production is due to that lower dry matter intake. So the rest of that lower milk production is not related to only lower dry matter intake if we calculate the nutrients that we supply to those animals in heat stress periods. But what we also see is we see a lower condition in those cows. We know that we see more negative energy balance in those cows. We see a lot more inflammation, which we will explain, which is related to probably leaky gut syndrome. But a lot of things happening in that animal cannot be explained just by the nutrients that we supply. That's only half of the negative effect. If we look at intestinal morphology, then we will see on the left side, that's an animal that's in neutral, thermal neutral basis without any heat stress. It's a nice and cool environment and animals are doing well, and look at that morphology. And if you compare that to animals' intestinal morphology, which is heat stressed, that middle picture, it's a totally different intestinal wall that we experience in that specific, if we compare that those photos to each other. And even when we stress those animals and pair fed them in a stress-related environment, we don't see the morphology similar to the middle one, which is heat stressed. This was done by peers, and we will explain a little bit more of now what's happening if we see that then. The same with ketosis. If we compare animals with ketosis, we also can only explain the lower production and repro problems related to lower intake. And that's only 50%. So if we give animals a specific diet and they experience ketosis and drop in dry matter intake by a specific percentage, the lower milk production is far more than that lower intake of nutrients. These research groups then started to focus and say, okay, so why do we see the lower milk production if it's not related to only nutrients? What they've also seen in a study is animals that experience ketosis, 2 weeks before calving, they saw in those animals a higher level of endotoxins from bacteria in the digestive tract. So animals which experience ketosis well before calving, even those animals, there was a lot of these endotoxins that entered the intestinal wall, different to animals that was not experiencing, or healthy animals that was not experiencing ketosis. So something else was then evaluated through research to see why is that. They also relate a lot of specific stress factors to tight junctions in these, if you compare that in the intestinal wall. All these, and this was just a schematic example by Prof. Lance to say, if these epithelium walls, there's a lot of tight junctions between them to keep them strong in between, but we see a lot of these tight junctions that's malfunctioning when animals are challenged by heat stress or by things like ketosis, and they looked further into the reason for that. So if we talk about leaky gut, two of the research groups found that if there's leaky gut, they saw a different metabolic response in those cows. They saw a different endocrine response. They saw a different immunometabolic response in those cows. And even in one of the publications recently, they saw a change in calcium metabolism, and I will show you some of the data later. And all these things related then to a lower milk production, a lower average daily gain in those heifers, and then a big negative on reproduction in those cows. So leaky gut has a very big effect on those, on the system, and we need to evaluate that consistently on a farm. Okay, so a lot of things through the through research was related to increased leaky gut, and this is just a few. The one thing is heat stress, which I will give you some information now. Hindgut fermentation. So if maize is animal 2 course, that will go through into the hindgut and ferment there, and that will also increase the risk of leaky gut. We see animals when they are weaned, calves, increase in leaky gut, things like slug feeding and many more will have an effect on leaky gut. Even if we slug feed them, for example, on pasture-based farms, we see that there's a higher risk of leaky gut, which will decrease the efficiencies of those cows. So we need to go into that. The one thing that the researchers came up with is that if we have heat stress, we see an increase in the lipopolysaccharides, the LPS, in those animals, which will stimulate the immune function or system. That will promote the inflammation production, and we see increase of a lot of these cytokines like the TNF alpha and many more when the LPS increases due to heat stress or any other challenge, as I indicated, which will give leaky gut. We know that will lower the dry matter intakes if we are higher in LPS. We see an increase in the amount of cows with fever. We even see a lot of muscle breakdown, a lot of cows without any energy. They're just restless on those farms, and then eventually lower production. So this is just a publication by peers to say it's a very, very quick process. So animals that experience heat stress will increase LPS very quickly. So if you look at the LPS in the jugular vein and you compare that to the time of heat stress, within 2 hours or 4 hours, you can see that there's increased trend. 6 hours, there's a statistical difference to the level that they've seen at 0, 2, and 4 hours. And look at the 12-hour rate where that LPS level is in those animals. It's just extremely quickly, and that will affect the animal. If we look at another study or the same study that used or compared animals which were thermal neutral, and this is not only in pigs, that it's also in different other animals. They also see this in ruminants. So this is just one trial to indicate that leaky gut can be a problem if animals are in heat stress. You will see that 12-hour heat stressed animal, what the level of endotoxins is going through the intestinal wall. It's it increases to a tremendously high level very quickly. So things are moving through the rumen epithelium quicker than we think when animals are stressed, like in this example, this research study. So there's many things that can do that. As I indicated in that one graph, is mycotoxins, high in gut acidosis, ketosis, a lot of trauma around calving time can increase your risk for leaky gut in those animals. And when they have leaky gut, we see an increase in LPS, an increase in insulin, and at the end of the day, we see the difference in the immune system that we see with the lower performance and lower feed intake. So things that we need to consider when we look at this. In systems where there's heat stress, we know that there's an increase in some of these growth hormone, or actually the catabolic hormones. We see a lot of cytokines increase in that. And at the end of the day, that outweighs some of the other things like insulin levels. And at the end of the day, we see that the animals have a negative effect. This was just a study where they compared the effect of weaning bull calves, and you can see they took bull calves and weaned them at day 42 after a step-down program versus non-weaned calves, and then used chromium EDTA as a marker of barrier function. And you can see the animals with that was weaned, there was a huge increase in their chromium EDTA levels, indicating that the barrier function was decreased and suboptimal for animals that went through wean stress. So stress-related things can also increase leaky gut syndrome. So let me just, okay. Then we all know that the transition cows, the dry matter intake differences in those cows, and as they get closer to calving, we know that the dry matter intake goes down. But for this example, in this study was just when they overfeed concentrates. That was the dotted line, so that was the cows with a higher concentrate level in comparison to animals with a higher level of fiber in their diet. You can see the cows getting too much concentrates. They were higher in intakes before calving, but when they got to calving period, they dropped in intakes far worse than the healthy cow or the high fiber cows, and they stayed lower for the whole period over the 9 weeks after calving. So very negative. They also saw increased LPS levels and also a decrease in the barrier function in those cows. So we need to prevent that and make sure that when we talk about nutrition, that we take this into consideration and don't overfeed specific animals with concentrates due to the leaky gut effect, especially those fresh cows. This was just 2 studies that was done to indicate if LPS around calving increases, what is that effect on animals around calving, as well as when they are heat stressed. And you will see that in both studies, when they have a LPS increase in the system, and they actually used LPS in a bolus, put that into the cows, and you can see that in both studies, the ionized calcium decreased in the one study 46%, and the other study that dropped with 39%. So a huge effect on calcium metabolism, or circulating calcium actually, in those animals, and we don't want that. Definitely not around calving. So if we can do anything to prevent leaky gut and get these cows to have an easier adaptation through that transition period, if we can give them a cooler environment so that they don't have too much heat stress, everything will help them to decrease that LPS levels in those cows to improve their health. So leaky gut syndrome is not just something that people talk about. It's a reality for us in South Africa. It's a reality on most dairy farms. And from that angle, we then just focus on the pre-calving and early lactation animals. We make sure that those animals don't experience too much heat stress. We don't do too much group and camp changes through that transition cow period. We try to optimize our diets through systems that we don't slug feed them, or that we use the diet strategies that may decrease our pH in those animals too aggressively. So if we can adapt those animals, then we can decrease that LPS level and then improve the animal's performance through that. A lot of publications, if you want to go and read about that, by Prof. Greg Penner from Canada, as well as Prof. Lance Baumgart and his group. They are doing really a lot. If you want to go and read, and we don't have time for that today, but go and read about leaky gut syndrome. It's amazing how much things they correlate with leaky gut. This is now the last part of my slides, and that's just applied nutrition through minerals. For you as a vet to have just a few things in mind when you talk about minerals on dairy farms, is we have a lot of variance, and I will show you the variance in other roughage sources as well. If you take, and this is just my own data basis of analysis, and if you take the almost 700 samples that went through our lab, and you compare just on iron, then you will see that the average is about 586 ppms. But if you compare the variance, and you will see the highest levels far over 8,000 ppms. Now, feeding a dairy cow and you suddenly have a raw material with that level, you will have repro problems, and a lot of discussion around that specific form of repro, as well as immunity due to that high level of iron. And that's the same even if you go to zinc and copper as well. Look at the high copper level in one of the samples that we had of 36, although the average is 6. So for you as a veterinarian working on dairy farms, you need to consider the variance of minerals in a specific herd. And always remember that not only in the silages, but also water. If I show you the data on water, it's scary if we look at the coefficient of variance of water as well. If you look at lucerne, it's not consistent. You can see there as well, there's variance there. And there's also some batches which is very high in some minerals. So looking at problems, have a look at the source as well before one just changes the premix or the mineral levels that they use in that form. Is we need to see what level is specific to that form. This is pastures, and we will do a few case studies regarding this as well. Look at the iron level. The average is 475 ppms of iron per kilogram of dry matter. But there is some of the farms where those pastures has high levels as high as 5,200, which is scary, with a standard deviation of 640, which is indicating that there is a lot of variance. And as the Americans always say, there's a lot of noise looking at micro minerals. on farms in roughages. So how do we formulate? We take our models, we use this average, and we for that specific farm, and then we calculate what's the requirement according to their production and days in milk and everything on that farm. And then we see, are we 100% required or are we lower? Like in this instance, they are short on potassium and sodium, but they're oversupplied in calcium and phosphorus. So we calculate everything, but what we need to always keep in mind is we work on the NRC model, the NRC tables. The NRC tables for dairy cows is almost 20 years old, so it's old data. But what we need to remember is all those requirements are calculated in animals which is not challenged by the environment. So if there's mud or there's a heat stress, those calculations, we need to adapt that according to the specific farm and the environment to really optimize minerals. So we can't just use NRC because your levels in some farms will just be too low. So that's the one thing. The other thing that's really frustrating for me, and I think for you as vets is even more, is the sources of minerals are not stated on any bag. So when you work with a farm and people are talking about things like zinc, then there's so many different sources. So let's take zinc oxide, for instance. It's 12%. The absorption coefficient is 12%. And if you compare that to zinc sulfate, it's almost double that. So if people are stating zinc, they just say zinc, they don't say the source. And that may affect your performance as a veterinarian on repro. And this is a huge headache in the industry. So the new legislation will force people to state in what form do they use their minerals, which will help you and me as well to make sure that that we use the correct source and not only formulate on total copper or total zinc for that reason. This is just a study or some data indicating mineral sources